Imagine setting out on a journey in the year 1347, telling your family you'll return in 3 months, but your bones will never see home again. Your last moments? Choking on your own blood as bandits rifle through your belongings on a muddy forest road. This wasn't rare. This was Tuesday in medieval Europe. Today, we're diving into the nightmare that was medieval travel, where leaving your village meant playing Russian roulette with death itself. By the end of this video, you'll understand why most medieval people never ventured more than 5 miles from where they were born, and why those brave enough to try often paid the ultimate price. Main content: the brutal reality of medieval roads. When we think of medieval travel today, we might imagine romantic images of knights on horseback or merchants with their caravans. But the reality was far more terrifying. The roads of medieval Europe were death traps, literally designed to kill the unwary traveler. Most roads were nothing more than dirt tracks, carved by centuries of cartwheels and animal hooves. During winter, these paths became rivers of freezing mud that could swallow a horse whole. In summer, they transformed into dust clouds that choked travelers and announced their presence to every bandit within miles. There were no streetlights, no police patrols, no emergency services. Once you left the relative safety of your village, you entered a world where human life held no value. The Roman Empire had left behind an impressive network of stone roads, but by the medieval period, most had fallen into disrepair. The centralized authority needed to maintain such infrastructure had crumbled along with the empire itself. What remained were dangerous ruins, cracked stones that could lame a horse, broken bridges that sent entire caravans plummeting into ravines, and overgrown sections that provided perfect hiding spots for those who preyed on travelers. But even when roads were passable, they were rarely safe. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of tiny kingdoms, duchies, and feudal territories, each with its own laws, customs, and dangers. A merchant might need to pay tolls to a dozen different lords on a single journey, and each payment was an opportunity for extortion, robbery, or worse, the bandit epidemic. Highway robbery as a way of life. Medieval bandits weren't the romantic outlaws of Robin Hood legend. They were desperate, violent men who had turned to robbery out of starvation, desperation, or simple cruelty. The collapse of centralized authority meant that law enforcement was virtually non-existent in rural areas. A band of robbers could operate with impunity for years, knowing that no organized force would come to stop them. These bandits developed sophisticated techniques for ambushing travelers. They would study trade routes, learning when merchant caravans typically passed through. They knew which travelers carried the most valuable goods, and they had networks of informants in towns and villages who would tip them off about wealthy targets. The most successful bandit groups operated like small armies. They would post lookouts on hilltops, dig concealed pits to trap horses, and even build fake bridges that would collapse under the weight of a loaded cart. Some groups became so powerful that they effectively controlled entire regions, demanding tribute from anyone who wished to pass through their territory. One of the most infamous examples was the brigand bands that plagued the forests of medieval France. These groups, known as routiers, were often composed of unemployed soldiers who had turned to banditry after wars ended. They knew military tactics, they had professional weapons, and they showed no mercy to their victims. Contemporary chronicles describe routiers torturing prisoners to reveal hidden wealth, holding travelers for ransom, and selling captives into slavery. The violence was horrific. Bandits would often kill their victims even after receiving their valuables, reasoning that dead men couldn't identify them later. They would strip bodies naked, not just to take clothing, but to ensure that nothing of value was left behind. Bodies were typically left to rot by the roadside as a warning to other travelers. The merchant's nightmare, trading routes of terror. Medieval merchants faced a particular kind of hell when traveling. Their wagons, loaded with valuable goods, were like magnets for every criminal in the countryside. The very nature of their business made them walking targets, and the profits from a single successful robbery could support a bandit gang for months. Merchants developed elaborate strategies to protect themselves, but these often proved inadequate. They would travel in groups, hire armed guards, and even disguise their most valuable cargo. But bandits were equally creative in their methods. They would infiltrate merchant caravans, posing as fellow traders or guards, only to strike when the group was most vulnerable. The textile trade was particularly dangerous. Cloth was valuable, portable, and easily sold, making it a favorite target for robbers. Merchant records from the period show that it was common for entire shipments to disappear without a trace. The merchants themselves often shared the same fate as their cargo. Wine merchants faced their own unique dangers. Wine was heavy, making it difficult to transport quickly, and it required regular stops to rest the horses. These predictable patterns made wine caravans easy targets. Moreover, drunk bandits were even more unpredictable and violent than sober ones. Spice merchants, dealing in the most valuable trade goods of the medieval world, hired small armies to protect their caravans. But even these precautions often failed. A well-organized bandit attack could overwhelm even a heavily guarded convoy, and the profits from capturing a spice shipment were enormous. The pilgrimage paradox. Sacred journeys. Deadly outcomes. Religious pilgrimage was one of the most common reasons for medieval travel, but it was also one of the most dangerous. Pilgrims were natural targets for bandits because they carried money for their journey, often traveled alone or in small groups, and were typically unfamiliar with the dangers of the road. The routes to major pilgrimage sites like Rome, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem were well-known bandit hunting grounds. Criminals would position themselves along these paths, knowing that a steady stream of vulnerable travelers would pass by. They showed no respect for religious purposes. In fact, they often specifically targeted pilgrims because they were seen as easy prey. The famous pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela in Spain was particularly notorious. The path wound through remote mountain passes and dark forests, perfect terrain for ambushes. Contemporary accounts describe pilgrims being robbed, murdered, and left to die by the roadside. Some bandits even posed as fellow pilgrims, gaining the trust of their victims before striking. The Crusades created additional dangers for religious travelers. The roads to the Holy Land were filled with disbanded soldiers, refugees, and opportunistic criminals. Pilgrims on these routes faced not only bandits, but also the threat of being caught in ongoing wars, enslaved by hostile forces, or dying from diseases that spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of medieval travel. Even when pilgrims survived the journey to their destination, they still had to make the return trip home. Many never did. They would die from disease, exhaustion, or violence on the way back, or they would simply disappear without a trace. Families would wait years for loved ones to return, never knowing if they were dead or alive. The technology of terror. Weapons and tactics. Medieval bandits were skilled in the art of violence, and they used every tool at their disposal to maximize their effectiveness. Crossbows were particularly favored because they could be used by relatively untrained men to kill armored opponents. A crossbow bolt could penetrate chainmail and drop a horse with a single shot. Caltrops, small metal spikes designed to puncture horse hooves, were scattered across roads to disable cavalry and force travelers to proceed on foot. Once dismounted, even well-armed travelers became much more vulnerable to attack. Bandit groups would often use psychological warfare to terrorize their victims. They would leave mutilated bodies in prominent locations, spread rumors about supernatural threats, and use intimidation to extract information about upcoming travelers. Fear was as powerful a weapon as any sword. Some bandit groups became so sophisticated that they operated like intelligence networks. They would place informants in monasteries, inns, and markets to gather information about wealthy travelers. They knew which merchants carried the most valuable goods, which pilgrims came from wealthy families, and which routes were most likely to be profitable. The weapons used by bandits were often crude but effective. Clubs, axes, and farm tools converted into weapons were common. These weapons were chosen not for their elegance, but for their ability to cause maximum damage with minimal training. A peasant with a club could kill a knight if he caught him by surprise. The wilderness threat. More than human predators. The dangers of medieval travel weren't limited to human threats. The European wilderness was filled with genuine predators that could kill travelers as easily as any bandit. Wolves were perhaps the most feared, and for good reason. Medieval wolf packs were larger and more aggressive than their modern descendants, and they had little fear of humans. Winter travel was particularly dangerous because hungry wolves would actively hunt human prey. Contemporary accounts describe wolf packs following travelers for days, waiting for signs of weakness. A lone traveler on foot had virtually no chance of survival against a determined wolf pack. Bears were another constant threat, particularly in forested areas. European brown bears were larger and more aggressive than most modern populations, and they were much more common. A surprised bear could kill a man instantly, and there was no reliable way to predict when such an encounter might occur. The very landscape itself was deadly. Swamps could swallow travelers whole. Rivers could flood without warning, and mountain passes could be blocked by sudden snowstorms. Without modern weather forecasting or rescue services, travelers who made poor decisions about weather and terrain often paid with their lives. Dense forests were labyrinths where travelers could become lost for days or weeks. Starvation and exposure killed as many travelers as bandits did. The familiar landmarks that allowed people to navigate near their homes became useless in unfamiliar territory. The inn deception. False sanctuaries. Medieval inns were supposed to provide safe refuge for travelers, but many were actually elaborate traps. Unscrupulous innkeepers would drug their guests' food or drink, rob them while they slept, and sometimes murder them to prevent discovery. The most infamous of these murder inns would dispose of bodies in hidden chambers or nearby rivers. Some innkeepers worked directly with bandit gangs, providing information about wealthy guests and even helping to plan attacks. A guest who displayed too much wealth or revealed information about his destination might find himself ambushed just down the road from the inn. The isolation of many inns made them perfect locations for crimes. Travelers who disappeared from remote inns might not be missed for weeks or months, and there were no authorities to investigate their disappearances. Some inns developed reputations for being unlucky places where guests frequently vanished, but desperate travelers often had no choice but to stay in them. Even legitimate inns were dangerous places. They were crowded with strangers, many of whom were armed and desperate. Fights were common, and a dispute over a game of dice or a perceived insult could quickly turn deadly. The combination of alcohol, weapons, and desperation made medieval inns powder kegs of violence. The plague factor. Death by disease. The Black Death and other medieval plagues turned travel into a form of suicide. Diseased travelers spread infection everywhere they went, and the crowded, unsanitary conditions of medieval travel made disease transmission almost inevitable. A single infected person could contaminate an entire caravan, inn, or ship. Plague victims often died horrible deaths while on the road, far from family and medical care. Their bodies would be left to rot where they fell, creating additional sources of infection for other travelers. Some plague victims, driven mad by fever and desperation, would attack other travelers in their delirium. The social breakdown caused by plague made travel even more dangerous. Entire communities would flee their homes, creating massive refugee populations that overwhelmed the resources of the areas they entered. These desperate people often turned to banditry to survive, adding to the existing criminal population. Quarantine measures, where they existed, could trap travelers in infected areas for months. Many who survived the initial plague outbreak would die from starvation or violence while confined to plague-stricken cities or regions. The legal nightmare. Justice without law. Medieval legal systems provided little protection for travelers. Laws varied dramatically from one territory to another, and what was legal in one place might be a capital offense in another. Travelers often found themselves accused of crimes they didn't know existed or punished for violating local customs they had never heard of. Many medieval jurisdictions actively discriminated against foreigners and travelers. Local courts would side with residents against outsiders almost automatically, and travelers had no recourse for appealing unjust decisions. A merchant who was cheated by a local trader might find himself accused of fraud and sentenced to death. The concept of diplomatic immunity didn't exist for ordinary travelers. Even official messengers and ambassadors could be imprisoned, tortured, or executed if they carried unwelcome news or if political situations changed while they were traveling. Corruption was endemic in medieval legal systems. Officials would demand bribes for safe passage, and travelers who couldn't pay would be imprisoned or worse. Some jurisdictions made their entire income from extorting travelers, creating elaborate bureaucracies designed to extract money from anyone passing through. The Weather Wars. Nature's assault on travelers. Medieval weather was more extreme than modern conditions, and travelers had no way to predict or prepare for sudden changes. The medieval warm period was followed by the Little Ice Age, creating unpredictable and dangerous weather patterns that could trap travelers in deadly situations. Winter travel was particularly hazardous. Blizzards could strike without warning, burying travelers in snow and ice. Frozen rivers and lakes could appear safe to cross, but would collapse under the weight of a horse and rider. Frostbite and hypothermia killed thousands of travelers every winter. Summer brought its own dangers. Flash floods could sweep away entire caravans, and drought could leave travelers stranded without water in remote areas. Heat exhaustion and dehydration were common causes of death, particularly for travelers who underestimated the physical demands of medieval travel. Spring flooding made many roads impassable for months at a time. Travelers who attempted to cross flooded areas often drowned or were swept away by rapidly moving water. The unpredictable nature of spring floods meant that routes that were safe one day could become death traps the next. While land travel was dangerous, maritime travel was often even more deadly. Medieval ships were small, poorly constructed, and completely at the mercy of weather and navigation errors. The combination of primitive technology and hostile waters made sea travel a form of suicide. Navigation was primarily based on dead reckoning and celestial observation, both of which were unreliable in cloudy or stormy weather. Ships would often become lost, sometimes for weeks at a time, until their food and water ran out. The lucky ones would find land. The unlucky would die of starvation or thirst. Storms were the greatest danger to medieval ships. A sudden squall could sink a vessel in minutes, and there was no way to predict when dangerous weather might strike. The lack of weather forecasting meant that ships would often sail directly into deadly storms. Piracy was as common at sea as banditry was on land. Medieval pirates were often more brutal than their land-based counterparts, as they could dispose of evidence by simply throwing bodies overboard. Entire ships would disappear without a trace, their fate unknown until wreckage washed ashore weeks later. Historical records, where they exist, paint a horrifying picture of medieval travel mortality. Contemporary chronicles suggest that as many as 1 in 3 travelers on long journeys never returned home. Some estimates put the mortality rate even higher for certain routes and time periods. The famous medieval chronicler Matthew Paris recorded that in the year 1250, fewer than half of the pilgrims who set out for the Holy Land ever returned. Disease, violence, and accident claimed the rest. Similar statistics exist for merchant expeditions, with some trade routes showing mortality rates approaching 50%. These weren't just numbers. They were human lives, each representing a family destroyed by loss, a business ruined by a failed expedition, or a community left wondering what had happened to their missing members. The psychological impact of this constant loss shaped medieval society in profound ways. The psychological impact, a society living in fear. The extreme dangers of medieval travel had profound effects on the development of European society. The isolation forced on communities by dangerous roads led to the development of highly localized cultures, each with its own dialects, customs, and traditions. The lack of safe communication between regions meant that knowledge and innovation spread slowly, if at all. Medieval people lived in constant fear of losing loved ones to the dangers of travel. This fear shaped their worldview and their behavior, making them suspicious of strangers and reluctant to venture far from home. The trauma of losing family members to travel was passed down through generations, creating a culture of caution that persisted for centuries. The selective nature of travel mortality also had long-term effects on medieval society. The people who died on the roads were often the most adventurous, the most skilled, or the most ambitious members of their communities. This brain drain had a cumulative effect, as each generation lost its most capable individuals to the dangers of travel. Conclusion: the price of movement. Medieval travel was a form of gambling where the stakes were life and death. The combination of banditry, disease, dangerous terrain, hostile weather, and corrupt authorities created a perfect storm of danger that claimed countless lives. Most medieval people understood this reality and simply stayed home, living their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. Those who did travel, merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and diplomats, did so knowing that they might never return. They made wills before departing, said goodbye to their families as if for the last time, and hoped that luck would see them through the dangers ahead. The medieval world was small not because people lacked curiosity or ambition, but because the price of exploration was so often death. Every journey was a potential tragedy, every road a potential grave. This was the dark reality of medieval travel, a world where leaving home meant entering a nightmare from which there might be no awakening. The few who did survive these journeys and return home were forever changed by their experiences. They had looked death in the face and lived to tell about it. Their stories, when they chose to tell them, painted pictures of a world so dangerous that most people could barely imagine it. In the end, medieval travel wasn't just about getting from one place to another. It was about surviving a gauntlet of death that claimed far more victims than victors. The roads of medieval Europe were paved not with good intentions, but with the bones of those who dared to walk them.